She stood there, soaked from the rain, shaking, with desperation in her eyes. "He's in danger," she whispered. But the man in the tailored suit only scoffed, sipping his espresso like nothing mattered. 3 weeks later, that same man would fall to his knees, crying, begging for the woman he once ignored, because only she could bring his son back alive. The rain didn't fall. It slammed. It punished the earth, the windows, and the woman standing at the tall iron gates of a mansion in upstate New York. Her fingers trembled as she pressed the intercom, her breath forming clouds in the cold October air. "Please," she whispered, not even sure if anyone was listening. "He's not safe. I know it doesn't make sense, but you have to believe me." Inside, the foyer was lit with chandeliers so bright they made the marble floor shine like ice. At the top of a sweeping staircase stood Richard Mallory, tech magnate, billionaire, and single father. He looked down at the housekeeper who had answered the intercom and raised an eyebrow. "Who is it this time?" he asked, his voice smooth, uninterested. "Some woman, sir. Says it's urgent, about your son." That made Richard chuckle. Not the warm kind. The kind that echoes in empty rooms. "What does she want? Money? A job? A picture with me?" "I think she's serious," the housekeeper replied softly. "Let her freeze," he said coldly, turning away. "It builds character." Outside, Evelyn Dorsey wasn't used to being ignored. Not anymore. Not after everything she'd been through. Her sweater clung to her skin, and her boots were soaked through, but she wouldn't leave. Not until someone listened. It wasn't about her. It was about the boy. Just 2 days earlier, Evelyn had seen something that rattled her to her bones. She was a nurse, part-time at the children's clinic, part-time at a psychiatric center downtown. She didn't believe in visions or fate or any of that, until she did. Until she had to. The boy, Caleb, Richard Mallory's son, had come into the clinic for a routine checkup. Evelyn wasn't supposed to be in that room, but something drew her there. The moment she touched his wrist to check his pulse, her world spun. It wasn't a seizure. It wasn't a hallucination. It was something she couldn't explain. A vision, fragments, broken glass reflections, a dark place, a scream, a fall, water, silence. She didn't know what it meant, only that it hadn't happened yet. Back at the mansion, Richard Mallory's laughter echoed down the hall as he poured himself a drink. "Let me guess," he muttered to himself. "She dreamed my son is in danger. How original." But that night, as he watched Caleb fall asleep, something gnawed at him. A tension in the room. An unnatural stillness. The boy stirred in his sleep, murmuring something Richard couldn't hear. A name. A cry. A splash. The next morning, Richard found Evelyn sitting at the bus stop across the street. She looked like hell, like she hadn't slept, hadn't eaten. She held a small journal in her lap, pages soaked, ink smeared. When she saw him, she stood. "I know what I saw," she said. He stared at her for a long moment, then simply replied, "And I know what crazy looks like." But what neither of them knew, not yet, was that something was coming. Something that would tear Richard's world apart, drag Caleb into the abyss, and force Evelyn into a choice that would break her all over again. She had warned him. He laughed. But soon he would beg. And only she could save his son. The Mallory estate was a world of its own. 10 acres of groomed land surrounded by electronic fencing, with a private security system more advanced than most government buildings. Inside, the mansion smelled like wealth, aged oak, imported leather, and something cold, almost clinical. Richard Mallory lived like a king in a kingdom built by algorithms and ambition. He wasn't cruel, but he was distant, emotionally armored, efficient, and consumed by his company's endless expansion. He saw people as variables, problems to solve. If they didn't yield a result, he dismissed them. His son, Caleb, was different. Gentle, unusually quiet for an 8-year-old, but curious in a way that unnerved most adults. He never asked for toys, just stories, the old kind, with dragons and shadows and secret doors. Since his mother died in a skiing accident 4 years ago, he'd spoken less and listened more. To Richard, Caleb was a puzzle he couldn't solve. He hired the best tutors, the best doctors, the best therapists. None of them brought the boy closer to him. And then came Evelyn Dorsey. Evelyn lived in a part of the city Richard never thought about, the one with flickering streetlights, laundromats with broken machines, and neighbors who kept curtains closed all day. Her apartment was small, cluttered, and smelled of chamomile tea and old books. Photos of people long gone covered her fridge. Her life was quiet, orderly, until the day of the vision. She hadn't told anyone. Not her supervisor, not her neighbor, not even her priest. Because no one would believe her. She barely believed it. But the more she thought about it, the more she remembered Caleb's eyes during that brief pulse check, the more sure she became. There was a darkness around the boy. Something circling. Something waiting. In the following days, Evelyn did what most would have been too afraid to do. She started watching. From across the street. From the park bench near the estate's garden wall. She didn't have a plan, only instinct. And something strange happened. Caleb noticed her. From the back seat of his black SUV. From his bedroom window. From behind the hedge where he played with his dog. He always saw her. He never smiled, but he looked. And one day he waved. That was the day she knew. The danger hadn't passed. It was getting closer. Back inside the mansion, Richard was growing uneasy. Caleb was sleepwalking now. Always at the same time. Always toward water, the pool, the koi pond, even the bathtub. Twice, Richard found him standing at the edge of the pool in the middle of the night, eyes open but blank. Doctors blamed it on stress. Night terrors. Childhood trauma. Richard didn't buy it. One night, unable to sleep, he looked through the old security footage. Evelyn was always there. Sitting. Watching. Waiting. She wasn't threatening. She wasn't loud. But she was persistent. And in one frame, just one, taken at 2:41 a.m., the camera caught Caleb standing by the fountain, staring at something unseen. And Evelyn, 30 yards away, turned her head sharply, at the exact same moment. The next day, Richard called his driver and had her brought to him. "I want answers," he said as she stood dripping in his grand foyer once more. "Real ones." She looked him dead in the eyes. "You won't believe me. But that doesn't matter." He didn't say anything. "He's not sick," she said. "He's being watched. Pulled. Something is calling him. If you don't trust me, that's fine. But if you wait, you'll lose him." Richard should have laughed again. Should have thrown her out. But something about her voice, calm, cracked, and completely convinced, made his skin crawl. He didn't trust her. But for the first time, he didn't trust his own certainty either. Evelyn was allowed to stay for one night, to observe Caleb. As a favor. As an experiment. That night would change everything. Evelyn sat quietly in the corner of Caleb's room, her eyes scanning every movement, every breath. The boy had barely acknowledged her presence. He was lying on his side, facing the window. The room was dim, lit only by a small nightlight shaped like a moon. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees. Inside, Evelyn watched for something she couldn't name. At 2:46 a.m., Caleb sat up. Not like a child waking from a bad dream. Like something had called him. He swung his legs off the bed and walked to the door, his eyes wide open but blank. Richard, who had insisted on watching from the hallway, stepped forward, but Evelyn held up a hand. "Don't," she said. "He isn't awake. If we interrupt now, We lose him. Reluctantly, Richard stayed still. Caleb walked slowly, barefoot, toward the east wing. Evelyn followed silently. He moved with eerie precision, almost as if following invisible footsteps left by someone or something before him. And then he stopped. In front of a room no one used anymore. It had belonged to Caleb's mother. He reached for the doorknob. Evelyn gently stepped between him and the door. "Caleb," she whispered, "do you know where you are?" No answer, but his hand moved away from the doorknob. A low creak filled the silence. The door, unopened for years, clicked and opened slightly. Just slightly. A cold gust spilled into the hallway. Evelyn turned to Richard. "There's something in this house." Richard looked pale. "A draft," he muttered. But he didn't believe it. The next morning, Caleb didn't remember a thing. But Evelyn did. She spent hours researching, cross-checking, digging into local archives. The mansion had a history, not of hauntings, but of tragedy. A fire in 1923. A missing child in 1962. A drowning in 1978. Always the same pattern. Children. Silence. Water. Evelyn returned to the room from the night before. She could feel it, a pull like gravity reversed. The air was heavier. Like the room remembered the grief. Remembered the pain. And that's when she found it. Hidden behind the closet wall. An old crawl space sealed by drywall and paint. She scraped it open and crawled inside with a flashlight. Dust. Cobwebs. Rodents. And then, something else. Drawings. Hundreds of them. Scrawled in charcoal and crayon, childlike but horrifying. Images of a boy in water. A shadow with no face. Eyes in the walls. At the center, a drawing of a woman holding a boy's hand, Evelyn's face unmistakable, even though it was decades too old. She staggered back out, heart racing. Something in this house had seen her before she ever stepped inside. That night, Evelyn demanded a meeting. "I don't care what you think of me," she said to Richard, "but you need to listen. Your son is being drawn towards something that lives here. It's not a ghost. It's a memory. A trauma repeating itself through the children who live in this house." Richard clenched his jaw. "You're telling me my home is cursed?" "I'm telling you," she said, "that unless we leave this place, Caleb will drown. Not just physically. He'll vanish from this world piece by piece, like the others before him." Richard wanted to call the police, the press, anyone who would explain what was happening in a rational, safe, scientific way. But he didn't, because deep down, he remembered his wife's last words. She had said something strange before she died, while unconscious in the ER. "He's already reaching for him." Richard had thought she was delirious. Now he wasn't so sure. Caleb's sleepwalking worsened. He stopped eating. He whispered to someone no one else could see. His drawings, once of rockets and dinosaurs, turned dark, a black hole swallowing a boy with green eyes. Richard's breaking point came the night he found his son standing on the edge of the estate's lake, 1 foot already in. He screamed and pulled him back. Caleb didn't resist. He just looked up and said, "He told me it's not scary. He told me I'll float forever." That's when Richard dropped to his knees and looked at Evelyn with a kind of desperation he had never allowed himself to feel. "What do I do?" he asked, voice cracking. "How do I stop this?" Evelyn looked at Caleb, then back at Richard. "You don't stop it," she said. "You go through it. With him." The mansion, once a symbol of status and security, now felt like a cage. The silence between its walls no longer held peace but pressure, like something unseen was waiting to exhale. Richard tried to continue his work remotely, but his thoughts never left Caleb. Evelyn stayed in the guest room. Her presence unsettled the staff, especially Martha, the longtime housekeeper. She didn't trust Evelyn, not because she thought she was lying, but because she feared she might be right. "There have always been shadows in this house," Martha admitted one night, cornering Evelyn in the kitchen. "Rooms that stay cold even in summer. Whispers in the vents. And the boy, he's been talking to someone in the mirrors since he could speak." Evelyn stared at her. "Why didn't you ever say anything?" Martha hesitated. "Because no one ever listens to the help." That night, Evelyn began documenting everything, each incident, each sketch Caleb made, each whisper he muttered in his sleep. The phrase he repeated most often? He said, "It's almost time." Meanwhile, Richard began unraveling in a different way. He hadn't spoken to his estranged brother, Daniel, in over 6 years. Their last conversation had ended in shouting and broken glass. Daniel had accused Richard of hiding behind money after his wife died. Richard accused Daniel of feeding off his success. But Richard remembered something else. Daniel had once studied folklore. He used to tell Caleb bedtime stories not from books, but from old whispers, dark tales about spirits bound to grief, about houses that remembered sorrow and fed on it. Swallowing his pride, Richard called him. Daniel didn't say hello. Just, "You finally believe me, don't you?" Daniel arrived the next evening, covered in tattoos and still smelling like whiskey and sawdust. He took one look at Caleb and went pale. "Richard, that boy isn't alone anymore." Evelyn watched the two men warily. "What are you saying?" Daniel nodded at Caleb's drawing. A new one, done that afternoon. A boy floating in water. Above him, a figure, not a man, but not quite a shadow either, with long arms and no face. "I've read about this. In a Louisiana case. In an orphanage in Michigan. Places where grief anchors something darker. They call it the Hollow One." "That's not a name," Richard said, frowning. "It's not meant to be," Daniel replied. "It's what's left when pain isn't buried. When it's fed." Meanwhile, Evelyn discovered a small room in the cellar that wasn't on any blueprint. It was behind a false wall, beneath the wine racks. Inside, moldy wallpaper, shattered porcelain dolls, and an antique basin filled with dark water. Water that never dried, no matter how many times she emptied it. Etched into the floorboards was a single phrase. "Return the grief, or let it claim what remains." That night, Evelyn dreamed of drowning. The subplots thickened. Evelyn began noticing her own reflection didn't always follow her. Once, she turned away from the bathroom mirror, and her reflection kept staring back. Martha's dog, who'd been in the estate for nearly a decade, refused to enter Caleb's room. And one of the security guards quit without warning after hearing a child's voice calling him by name at 3 a.m., when no child was awake. Tension cracked the surface of every relationship in the house. Richard and Evelyn fought over what steps to take next. Daniel pushed for a ritual cleansing, which Richard called medieval nonsense. Evelyn insisted they wait, observe, let Caleb guide them. But time was running out. Caleb had started drawing new images. No longer just water. Now, a doorway, a submerged staircase, and someone walking down into it, someone with red hair. Evelyn's hair. She realized with sudden clarity, Caleb wasn't being pulled to his death. He was being pulled into memory. Someone else's memory. The house wasn't just haunted. It was infected by something that had been here long before them, something that fed on the unresolved pain of the past. The deeper they searched, the more they realized they couldn't just save Caleb. They had to confront the sorrow buried in the foundation of the mansion itself. It began with the rain. A storm rolled over the estate with no forecast warning. Sudden, violent, unnatural. The kind of rain that sounded more like pounding fists than falling water. The house groaned with every gust of wind. And in the middle of it all, Caleb disappeared. It happened so fast. One moment, Evelyn was in the study with Richard and Daniel, arguing about what the next step should be. The next, Martha was screaming from the second floor. "He's gone. He's not in his bed." They searched every room, every hallway, the attic, the basement, the greenhouse, the lake. Nothing. No signs of struggle. No open doors. Just an eerie stillness, and that same chill that had started to feel like a signature of the Hollow One. Evelyn's heart hammered in her chest. She knew this wasn't a simple disappearance. This was it. The final pull. The darkness had taken Caleb. But then they found the drawing, pinned to the inside of Evelyn's door. Drawn in a shaky, hurried hand, like Caleb had been rushing or scared or both. It was a staircase, one they hadn't seen before. Spiral, descending, endless. At the bottom, a doorway shaped like an eye. Inside the eye, a single figure, Evelyn. Underneath it, in smudged pencil. "He says only you can follow me." Evelyn didn't hesitate. She went straight to the hidden cellar room, where the basin of black water still sat. She knew now it wasn't just symbolic. It was a threshold, a passage. The flooded staircase in the drawings, it wasn't metaphor. It was real. Richard grabbed her arm. "If something happens to you—" "I don't matter," Evelyn interrupted. Her voice didn't shake. "He does." Daniel lit a candle, whispered a prayer under his breath. Something old, something raw, not found in any church book. And Evelyn stepped into the water. At first, nothing happened. Then everything shifted. She felt herself falling, but not through space. Through memory. She landed on a cold stone floor, soaked, coughing. The world around her was dim, flickering candlelight, wet stone walls, the air heavy with sorrow. Not fear. Sorrow. She had entered the house's memory. Children's voices echoed faintly through the tunnels. Not crying. Singing. A lullaby. The kind meant to keep monsters away, or to keep them company. She walked forward. The passage grew narrower. Tighter. She passed doors with names carved into them. Michael, 1962. Isabel, 1978. Thomas, 2005. Faces of children drawn on the walls, warped by time, staring at her with hollow eyes. Then she found Caleb. He was sitting on the edge of a well carved into the stone, staring down into the black water. He didn't look afraid, just tired. "He says you understand now," Caleb said softly, without turning. "He lost his child. A long time ago. And no one came." Evelyn knelt beside him. "So now he takes others? He just wants someone to remember." Caleb looked at her finally. "He thinks I'm like his son." Tears welled in her eyes. "You're not. And he doesn't get to choose." The shadows shifted behind them. The Hollow One was close now. Not approaching, watching, listening. Evelyn stood. And she did the only thing no one had done for this sorrowful spirit. She spoke. "I don't know your name," she said, voice echoing through the corridor. "I don't know who you were, or what happened. But you don't have to keep them anymore. You don't have to be alone." A pause. The air thickened. The candlelight dimmed. "I see your grief," she said. "And I'll carry it. I'll remember. But you have to let him go." For a long moment, nothing moved. Then the well trembled. The drawings along the walls began to melt, the faces softening, crying, then smiling. The names on the doors faded into mist. The lullaby in the air slowed and stopped. And the darkness lifted. The Hollow One had been heard. And that was all it ever wanted. Evelyn took Caleb's hand. Together, they walked up the stone steps, which no longer led to sorrow, but to the surface, to the mansion, to life. As they emerged from the cellar, the storm broke. The sun was rising. The morning after the storm, everything felt still. No wind, no birdsong, just quiet. Like the house itself was holding its breath. Evelyn sat wrapped in a blanket on the sunroom couch, her hands trembling slightly as she held a cup of tea. Caleb was upstairs asleep in her room, not because anyone told him to go there, but because he had chosen to. He hadn't let go of her hand all night. Richard stood at the window, staring out across the grounds. The lake shimmered with golden light, calm and clean for the first time in months. "So," he finally said, voice low, "it's over." Evelyn didn't answer immediately. She looked down into her tea. "I don't think it ever really ends. But it let go." He turned. "And if it comes back?" She met his eyes. "Then someone else will have to listen the way we did." Daniel had already left. No goodbye. No explanations. Just a note scribbled on the back of a receipt. "It heard you. That's more than most souls ever get. Take care of the boy." Martha resumed her duties, though she now placed salt bowls at every doorframe, muttering old prayers under her breath. She still refused to go near the cellar. She'd padlock the door and cover it with a rug, like it had never existed. The house felt different now. Not healed, but lighter. Richard's change was more subtle. He no longer worked late into the night. He canceled all international travel. His phone stayed face down most days. When Caleb spoke, Richard listened, truly listened. Sometimes, he still found his son whispering to himself in the garden. But not in fear. In peace. "Do you still hear it?" Richard asked once. Caleb nodded. "But it's just sad now. Not hungry." As for Evelyn, she stayed. Not because she had nowhere else to go, but because Caleb wanted her there. And for the first time in her life, she felt wanted without being used. She began journaling again, not just about the hollow one, but about grief and silence, and how memory could become both a curse and a cure. One afternoon, while cleaning out one of the old guest rooms, she found a photo tucked inside a book of poetry. A boy from the 1920s, standing beside a well. Behind him, a man with soft eyes and a haunted smile. No names written. Just a date. 1919. The year the Hollow One had lost his child. Weeks passed. The nightmares stopped. Caleb smiled more. Evelyn laughed again. And Richard, he changed the locks, but he didn't build more walls. Instead, he invited Evelyn to help renovate the East Wing, the one that had belonged to his late wife. He wanted to turn it into something new. A library. 4 stories. 4 memory. 4 peace. But one night, long after everyone had gone to bed, Evelyn sat alone in the kitchen, staring at a blank page in her journal. A faint sound drifted in from the cellar below. A lullaby. Soft. Gentle. Echoing through stone. She closed her journal. And whispered, "I remember. You're not alone." Evelyn had always thought of healing as something linear. A clean bandage. A firm stitch. The kind of fix that closed a wound and made it disappear. But what happened in the Mallory mansion, what happened to Caleb, through her, and because of Richard's silence, wasn't a clean wound. It was something that kept reopening, but gentler each time. 3 months after the storm, Caleb began speaking about his mother again. Not with confusion. Not with sadness. With curiosity. "She used to read to me from a green book," he said one evening while building a puzzle on the library floor. "But I lost it when she died." Evelyn remembered the green book. She'd found it on the lowest shelf in the East Wing, its spine cracked, pages filled with pressed leaves and half-finished letters from a woman who had written stories not for an audience, but for him. She placed it beside him without saying a word. Caleb stared at it like it had come back from the dead. "Sometimes," he whispered, "it feels like she's still here." Evelyn nodded. "Maybe she is. Maybe love leaves a mark deeper than death." Richard had changed, too. He no longer rushed conversations. He let silence hang when Caleb needed it. And sometimes, he watched Evelyn like she was an answer to a question he had been afraid to ask. He still struggled, especially at night, especially with guilt. But he tried. He showed up. That, Evelyn had learned, was rare. One afternoon, she found him sitting alone in the cellar, the rug pulled back, the padlock open. "I wanted to see if it felt different," he said without turning. "And does it?" He looked up. Yes, still heavy, but not hostile. Then he looked at her. "You stayed when you didn't have to. Why?" She considered the question. Her voice was quiet. "Because I know what it's like to feel something coming for you. To be small, alone, screaming, and no one listens." She took a breath. "And because when I looked at Caleb, I saw myself." Slowly, Evelyn began opening the house to others. Local children with trauma, grieving families, people who had nowhere safe to process their sorrow. She converted part of the estate into a retreat center, a quiet, protected space for memory, healing, and stillness. People came. They walked the gardens. They shared stories in the library. And they cried, a lot. But they left with lighter hearts. As if the house had become something more than a monument to grief. It had become a witness to survival. One of the first children to stay at the retreat was a girl named Nina, 8 years old, whose twin had died in a fire. She hadn't spoken a word in months, but she took to Caleb instantly. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. They would sit beneath the old willow tree together, silently sketching side by side. Sometimes, Caleb would read to her from the Green Book. One day, Evelyn found a crumpled paper under Nina's chair. A drawing. 2 girls holding hands beneath a tree. Both smiling. And in the corner, in messy handwriting, "It's okay to miss someone forever." For the first time in decades, the mansion wasn't swallowing pain. It was releasing it. Evelyn's growth was quieter, less visible. But inside, something profound had shifted. She no longer feared the silence in her own life. She no longer saw her empathy as a burden. She understood now that her ability to see what others refused to look at was not madness. It was her gift, her calling. One night, Richard stood on the library balcony as a storm approached in the distance. He turned to Evelyn. "Do you still see it sometimes? The hollow one?" Evelyn didn't answer immediately. Then she said, "No, not in the shadows. But I feel it in people, in the way they carry pain they think no one can see." Richard looked back at the storm. "And what do you do when you feel that?" Evelyn smiled faintly. "I sit with them. I listen. I remember." Healing had not made them whole, but it had made them human again, and that was enough. Though the mansion had grown quiet, the kind of silence it held was not forgetfulness. It was the silence of waiting, of holding something unfinished. Evelyn sensed it first. It started with small things. Cracks appearing again in the basement floor. Whispers behind doors that hadn't been opened in weeks. Nightmares that returned, but not to Caleb. To her. One night, she dreamed of the well again. Only this time, she was the one sitting at its edge. No child. No song. Just the sense that someone or something was behind her, waiting for her to look. She never did. She woke up sweating, heart pounding, the taste of damp earth in her mouth. Evelyn kept it to herself. She didn't want to alarm Richard or Caleb. Life had finally settled into something stable. They were laughing more. living more. The estate had even been accepted into a non-profit wellness foundation. But the shadows had their own sense of timing, and they had not forgotten her. It was Daniel who broke the silence. He returned unexpectedly one evening, just as a fog rolled in off the hills, heavy and unnatural, sinking low across the estate grounds. He didn't knock. He simply appeared at the gate, pale and frantic, holding a thick black folder full of handwritten notes. "I found something," he said, eyes wild. "I was wrong. We were all wrong." The hollow one, he explained, wasn't just grief. It was a gatekeeper, a guardian of unresolved sorrow, bound to the location of its greatest loss. It only let go of its victims when someone willingly took on the memory and bore it with compassion. But it didn't leave. It transferred. And now it had attached itself to Evelyn. She listened in silence as Daniel read from old folklore texts and reports from orphanages, monasteries, and historical estates. Over and over, the pattern repeated. One woman, one child, one act of compassion, followed by a slow internal decay. Evelyn had unknowingly accepted the burden. The hollow one had not been defeated. It had simply changed hosts. Richard was furious. Not with Evelyn, with himself. He had let her take the risk. Let her step into the darkness. And now she was paying a price they hadn't seen coming. Evelyn, however, was calm. "This was always going to be mine to carry," she said softly. "From the moment I touched Caleb's wrist that day at the clinic, it started then. I just didn't know it. But Caleb did." That night, he slipped into Evelyn's room and placed one of his drawings on her pillow. It showed her standing in front of a gate, hands glowing, a figure behind her made of light and shadow, not threatening, not attacking. Following, watching, trusting. Beneath it, he'd written just one line. "He knows you'll set him free." They all understood what had to come next. Evelyn would have to return. One last time. Not into the memory, but into the source, the moment of original grief. The place beneath the house that even the hollow one feared. A space layered with hundreds of years of sorrow. A crossing. A reckoning. Daniel called it the root cellar. It was never shown on any blueprint. Hidden below the original foundation, sealed with stone and iron. They found it behind a crumbling brick wall in the wine cellar. It had no key, only a symbol. The same symbol Caleb had been drawing in the margins of his notebooks for weeks. A spiral inside a tear. As the fog thickened outside and the air in the house grew heavy again, Evelyn stood at the threshold of the root cellar, the others behind her, holding torches. Richard's voice cracked as he spoke. "You don't have to go alone." Evelyn turned. "I do," she said. "But I'm not afraid anymore." And with that, she stepped into the dark. The stairs into the root cellar were narrow and spiraled, carved not by machines but by hand, uneven, old, and pulsing with something beneath the stone. With every step Evelyn took, the air thickened. Not with dust or mold. With memory. The grief here was alive. She descended in silence, torch in one hand, her other brushing the wall for balance. Symbols were carved into the stone at intervals, spirals, teardrops, hollowed eyes. And names. So many names. Some carved neatly, others scratched in frantic desperation. At the bottom of the staircase, she reached the door. It wasn't made of wood. It was made of bone. Human, animal, she couldn't tell. The pieces were fused together, lacquered in something that had once been red. A lock of hair hung from a nail in the center. The spiral tear symbol was carved above it, glowing faintly. It pulsed like a heartbeat. She pressed her palm to it. It opened. The chamber beyond wasn't a room. It was a void. Black walls. Black ceiling. Black water covering the floor like a mirror. No sound. No echo. Just Evelyn, standing in the memory of all who had been lost here, and all who had lost something. She stepped forward. The water barely rippled. Then, from the center of the space, a shape emerged. It wasn't sudden. It didn't leap or scream. It rose, slow and mournful, as if waking from centuries of sleep. The Hollow One. But this time, it wasn't just a shadow. It had eyes. Human eyes. Red-rimmed, wet with sorrow. Its form was both terrible and familiar, like every grief Evelyn had ever felt had taken a body and walked toward her. "I know you," she said aloud, her voice the only sound in the dark. The Hollow One didn't speak, but it listened. "You've held too much for too long," she continued. "You've carried others' pain because no one would carry yours." She stepped closer. The water deepened. She didn't care. "I can't undo what happened to you. I can't fix what was broken. But I can be here. I am here." The Hollow One let out a sound. Not a growl, not a scream. A sob. One that echoed through the chamber, through the roots of the house above, through time itself. The water swirled. Images formed in it. The fire in 1923, the boy who drowned in 1962, the girl who disappeared in 1978. Faces of grief. Eyes of children who were never found. Parents who had no closure. Love that had nowhere to go. The Hollow One stepped aside. Behind it, another figure appeared. A boy. The first child. The one it had lost. He walked slowly toward Evelyn and looked up at her. His hand was cold, but solid. Then he turned to the Hollow One. He smiled and whispered, "You can let go now." Light broke through the ceiling. Not sunlight, memory light, warm and full. The walls of the chamber cracked, not from collapse, but from release. The bones that formed the door dissolved into dust. The black water turned clear. And the Hollow One, after all these years, simply stepped back and vanished. Not in agony, in peace. Evelyn sank to her knees, tears pouring down her face. Not from fear, not from sadness, from release. When she opened her eyes again, she was in the garden, the real one. The willow tree swayed gently above her. Richard and Caleb were running toward her from the house, Daniel close behind. Caleb reached her first. He didn't speak. He just hugged her. Hard. "She did it," Richard whispered, barely believing. "She really did it." No more storms came after that. No more fog. The house, for the first time in over a century, felt alive. In the days that followed, no one spoke of the Hollow One again, not because they had forgotten, but because it no longer needed to be remembered in fear. It had been seen. It had been heard. And now it was at rest. Evelyn remained at the estate, not out of duty but by choice. The retreat center expanded quietly, room by room. Children came with questions, with silences too heavy for their families to carry. Adults came with losses they hadn't spoken of in decades. And the house, in its quiet way, welcomed them all. Richard transformed more than anyone could have predicted. He gave up full control of his company, delegated, slowed down, began mentoring, not managing. He joined Evelyn during morning walks with Caleb through the orchard behind the house, where birds had returned and the air smelled of wild lavender again. He no longer looked like a man trying to outrun his past. He looked like a man who had survived it. Caleb thrived. He still drew, but now his pages were filled with stars and ships and deep-sea explorers who always made it home. His laughter came easily. He asked questions. He played. He dreamed. He no longer walked in his sleep. And Evelyn, she kept the journal. But now, the entries weren't filled with warnings and fear. They were filled with names, every child, every parent, every wound the house had witnessed and helped heal. Not to hold on to the pain, but to honor it. to make sure none of it was ever forgotten again. Because remembering wasn't what brought the darkness. It was forgetting. One crisp autumn morning, she stood alone under the willow tree, where Caleb had once drawn two figures in the dirt, her and the hollow one, standing side by side. The leaves danced above her. The wind carried something familiar in its breath. And just for a moment, she felt the presence again. Not heavy, not hollow, just there. Like a memory, like a final goodbye. Years later, long after the last guest had come and gone, and after the garden had overgrown with wildflowers and ivy, a boy wandered the edge of the estate with a sketchbook under his arm. He was not lost. He was looking. He paused beneath the willow tree, where the wind still whispered, and opened his notebook. His drawing was simple. A house, a light in the window, and a figure at the door, not monstrous, not faceless, just someone waiting to be remembered. He smiled, as if he'd heard something in the silence, then kept drawing. If this story touched something inside you, a memory, a feeling, a silence you thought you carried alone, share it. Tell someone. Write it down. Remember that grief is not weakness, and silence is not safety. What we bury too deep can grow wild beneath us, shaping everything we love. But when we speak, when we listen, we break the cycle. We become the light in someone else's window. So if this story meant something to you, pass it on. Because maybe, just maybe, you'll help someone find the courage to remember, too.